To begin with, I just want to thank all of you for being in conversation with us. I think for the viewers that we have, one could consider this dialogue to be about, the idea of the formation of the collective, what that means to you all individually and also sensorially. I mean, after all, one has to feel through the moment. And I think that struck as a very strong, let's say, undertone to how we felt this collective was coming into being. I want to leave it a little open to you all to talk about, for you all, how the collective came about.
Yeah, for me, the idea when we kind of first started talking about the collective and the kind of forming one, the idea was just to kind of be more playful and to do kind of more of our thinking in public. For me, with my process, I kind of tend to go, it can be very solitary and kind of very kind of research based. We felt we wanted to do something that was a bit more playful, that we could kind of bounce ideas more off one another. It wasn't something that necessarily had a very long kind of thought process behind it. As any great thing, sometimes it's just an idea and then just kind of gets pushed into motion.
That's kind of what's been interesting also, right? We came together as a group of people who just wanted, what we articulated at the time was, let's think about making work located in intimate and playful. And I'm not sure we even have or had the language at the time to really answer maybe even why we sort of wanted to focus on the intimate and the playful. It developed in the apartment, and then we invited all these sort of folks together. That initial understanding, I think, came up from conversation. We're really thinking about what we thought was our understanding of the art world, and right now it feels like we're much more in a place of putting language to thought that was happening, and trying to realize, okay, oh, this is what it is. Oh, this is what's going on.
And in it, I think there was also, just to add, that the fact that we are coming as artists together to do it on ourselves, not waiting for a curator or gallery or anyone to invite us or to program us or anything, but this is something we take on and we do just for ourselves. And so therefore we can be playful with it, and it can be whatever, and just opening up process. And, so that was kind of also very much something that we kind of let's take ownership of this and just do it.
Yeah, I mean, I was mostly sold on the food. Pretty early on, Sandev prepared some really good bites for one of our initial meetings, and ever since then, I've been waiting for a return of that. But yeah, I think it's very much, as I think Cassie was speaking to, this sort of organic thing that happened, this sort of relationality between the artists, as you were speaking to before as well. This idea of a sort of interdisciplinary collective has been really interesting, at least for me, in the sense of I've gained quite a bit of insight into each of my fellow artists' sort of processes, as well as the processes that we've been collectively engaged in creating work together.
What happens in an understanding of a collective is that how do you actually untether it from cultural specificity on the one hand, while it also needs to have that, but also needs to speak to sort of concerns that might be across lines of sight, which are beyond region. Is there a sense of responding to time and history at this moment through the formation of a collective now?
It's an interesting question because there's two layers to it. Initially, there was a lot of discussions we had. I mean, we were just a bunch of friends really meeting up together in the apartment, and all of us would meet up anywhere, and then suddenly we decided, hey, why don't we do something together? And we sort of call people out for dinner. And then we sort of I think in that process, in the process of exchanging ideas located within a particular space in the art world, for example, or sort of feeling a sense of a general way of working that a lot of us felt like it was time to break out of or experiment outside of, which was mainly sort of producing work for the next festival or the next exhibition. And I feel like one of the things that excited us about coming together in the packet was the option to do the exact opposite. Like Cassie said, play, ideate too much about what we're doing, essentially, just to sort of get back to the childish level of basicness in terms of how we're sort of thinking about what we're feeling, and then to sort of respond through that and see where that kind of led, in a sense. So in that sense, I would definitely say, I mean, again, looking back, And like Sandev said, a lot of this stuff is sort of emerging to us now that we sort of look back on this journey after 2 years. It could be framed as a response to regionalism in a sense of refusing to speak from our geopolitical positionality or historical or racial or structural positionality, and then trying to speak from, I don't know, a more universal point of view. Like, why can't we speak to what it means to be human at the most basic level? And why can only certain artists or certain parts of the world be respected speaking that way? I'm not saying that that's actually a conscious grievance, but maybe there are undertones of that sort of like going on in how we're sort of like thinking about our work. But the second question is like interesting to me, this idea of even being a collective, you know, I mean, we never really sort of like thought of ourselves as a collective. Initially, it was us just gathering around to produce this deconstructed book, as we called it. And then before we even knew it, we started referring to ourselves as a collective. And then other people start referring to us as a collective. And then we become a collective. But what that really means only comes into focus when we have to start making decisions together, or when we have to start doing aspects that are organizational, not really sort of like community oriented anymore, you know? And this is when we start really thinking about what the difference is between a bunch of friends who are all artists meeting together and doing things together. The difference between that and an artist collective, which is very often like an external idea, something we see from the outside that we sort of like known, but we never really, most of us have never really sort of experienced that from the inside, at least not at the level of working that we are beginning to do now. So it's very interesting to confront this moment, to start thinking about what we are really and what does that really mean. You know?
For me, I found it really interesting when we were doing kind of our early derivations of packet, of seeing so much kind of cross-pollination and interconnectedness within our works and within our thinking that I wasn't aware that there was so much of. I suppose it's those interlinkages between us that really tie us to the place and our identity and what our work is speaking to, or where our work is speaking to.
Like I was saying, that's just this kind of emergence, that is happening as it goes along. I think you started with the question of what is South Asia. I find that really interesting, in the context of regionalism. As we are speaking, we're speaking about the language we had before and the language we're finding now. There is some of that language that still made it into the now. And that's the language of like an intimacy that, like Halik was saying, you bring your whole person to a way of speaking and working. And I think under the context, and for me, that fits into this question of what is South Asia. I think we were also responding to, at that time, this sort of need for artists to speak to or speak about something in a very, very particular way, almost in a kind of liberal politics in the way that you made your work. And then this question became, why is it that we have to theorize every time we make work, when that's not always necessarily the case in other parts of the world or in other circumstances. And I think that's how it leads to that question of what if we then start speaking differently? What if we were to sort of dive into this place of intimacy? And that's where I think for me it was really interesting what Cassie was saying, is when we decided to dive into this place to maybe abandon that or refuse that need to either theorize in a particular way and articulate the work we make in a particular way, and instead like go really very personal, playful, and intimate. That turn towards the kind of intimate, or let's say even the hyper local, has made our work quite interesting. Because during the pandemic, we wrote these letters to each other. It was a way of kind of engaging with each other, and there were just emails that we started writing to each other based on this open call that we got. And instead of again, how artists from South Asia are supposed to respond to a particular idea, we were talking about this dream someone had, or this experience of a phone call you get from an old church friend and things like that. And there's interesting space there for politics, but the way the politics is coming up is different, I guess. I think speaking from versus speaking to or speaking at, speaking about. Yeah, given this current time, that feels like the big kind of process shift.
I think it's also what kind of emerges despite, even though there are all these ways of thinking, maybe not a conscious attempt to avoid regionalism, but to adopt a different way of speaking, like Sandev said, and then delving into that process, but then also looking at what emerges is another interesting aspect to think about, because really all of what we are talking about are very situated stories, very sort of hyperlocal realities in that sense. So we are really talking about what we know. It's like interesting to think about this idea of regionalism and and universalism? And does it become regional just because you are situated in the region and then talking from your reality or knowledge of that region? Or is there something else that makes something regional?
We're realizing the sort of need to talk about pedagogy and practice, right? While there is a specific focus on micropolitics, on language as specific and also something to evolve with the passage of time, all of this feeds into a pedagogy. It might be an internal pedagogy, and I suppose that is so nicely aligned to a practice that might evolve as well. So just your take on pedagogies and practices and the challenges while thinking about a formation, a creative, social, and maybe informal formation like the one you all have now.
Personally, because I come from a performance practice, and because we started with this idea of making, not as an idea of making a collective, but as Halik said, to make a deconstructed book, it was something just completely out of my practice, something that I was not used to doing. And so for me, in these moments of gathering and talking and planning, I learned, there's a lot of things that I learned, and a lot of things, even like Imaad said, from the practices of the others, and how to share what I do in a very different way made me reflect on my existing practice and shift a lot of things. It has been a huge learning experience, and it still continues to be. On top of that, the sense of, Sandev talked about the sense of friendship and intimacy. We could actually, it comes from, the learning also comes from a place of being so vulnerable and sharing everything, sharing all, because we also, few of us live together, then we eat together, all this kind of way of being and sharing is, I think, it's kind of really very special. Now that I'm physically not in the same space anymore. Now I'm just thinking like, it's not going to happen so naturally. What can we do to continue? How can I continue to engage, and how can we continue to exchange in a way that is not like formulating it too much, but still we need to also at some point, certain things need to get structured more.
We were like, hey, let's make a book. We started coming together, sitting together, talking together. The book, some of it happened. It's still very much a working process, but there is whole other pedagogy emerged. Started thinking through it as this idea of study, what Martin and Hani sort of call this idea of study, of collaborative study. And that's kind of also emerged now from this very, very practice-based kind of initial motivation. The things that we're looking at now, we're thinking through output. What does it mean to output process? What does it mean to prioritize that? And still put things out there, but process that emerges from this pedagogy. I think that's been quite really interesting. So what does it mean then for us to come up together and make a book, end up cooking dinner together, spending time together, exchanging ideas together, and then finding out that the book is expensive to produce, and then doing all these other things, and then having people refer to you as a collective, and then, we have to start like internally thinking about what it means to be like write updates, like wrong updates, and send it to everybody else. All this time it's been so much more of a pedagogical exercise in friendship and being together. So that's been an interesting part for us too. Where it's like, oh wow, okay, now we have to figure all these things out.
Okay. One is, of course, the book. Is it a document of a time? What is this sort of changing temporality of the documentary? It resonated with the sense of everywhereness. It was sort of very sensitive to a certain kind of societal malaise. It was very sensitive to the problems of actually encountering microcultures also. That deconstructed book was also deconstructing the documentary in some respect, which is such a need of the hour, especially as one moves towards the filmic or the pro-filmic. Is this a sort of shifting, let's say, tenor within maybe even your individual practices?
There's like a few things in there. I think one of the, for me, when I think about a book, it feels like a very kind of finalized form, with a particular pedagogy or all these things that we've been talking about, whereas we very much designed the formation of the packet, and that's kind of why we called it a packet, was that it was kind of formless and that it was kind of fluid and multidimensional and intersectional, and it was very much about your own physical kind of engagement with that object and taking it apart and how it would be taken apart when you came to do it in a very individualistic way. And I think for me that is kind of also a reflection of, when we think of the term documentary or the specificity of time, again, it kind of refers to something as being very fixed and linear, and the fact that the truth is there is one particular truth. And I think, yeah, like when we were thinking about it, we kind of were trying to pick that idea apart and kind of draw the attention to the multiple perspectives, you know, kind of those being all of ours can exist in one particular moment and in one particular document, but that there wasn't one particular way of articulating that, and that, you know, maybe we also can't articulate ourselves, and that was kind of the play that we were trying to have. So I think, you know, in trying to do our thinking in public, I think, you know, we're trying to ask questions more than that we're trying to give one particular linear line of, you know, for an answer.
I think Imaad said it really well once in one of our Instagram live broadcasts when he said, "Don't theorize, just realize."
Yeah.
and you know, it's also interesting, this artist we were talking to recently in Sri Lanka, one of our friends also, we were talking about the packet, and he was like, "Oh, I thought you guys were just like an Instagram account," you know, because really the book hasn't come out yet. And but I feel like Instagram and how we sort of work with Instagram stories is, like, to touch on what Cassie said, an interesting kind of metaphor, I feel, for the book also, because it's like this a curation of a continuous desiring production, a flow that we're all connected to in a sense. And then we came together in these 3-4 months to kind of, like, I don't know, just take stuff out, pick and choose things out of this flow without making any sense or meaning out of explicitly. I feel like we privilege the notion of conversation, of being together, of community, and then allow these things to kind of create frameworks. The flow was deconstructed and present in this book, you know. And in that sense, I feel like, yeah, it is very much a documentation of a moment, but what sort of documentation? Is it trying to say something? It's not something that's clear to me at the moment. And I feel like it's really interesting to think about how we work on Instagram, because we all share our Instagram account, and it's a very casual thing that we keep putting things on the stories, and it's interesting to see connections starting to develop between these consequent stories also. And these are all very ephemeral things that come and go very quickly. So is that some sort of a documentation? I mean, definitely for me it is, but then what does it really mean? What sort of value it has? What is it trying to say is not really, that's not really been something we've ever been concerned about. What is it actually trying to say? You know, I think that's too much of an explicit question for us in most of what we've been doing.
From all these kind of organic, friendly dinners, from what it sounds like, how did you all arrive at the idea of the publication being sort of the form you want to, because you come from such diverse forms and formats. So how did that come around in your discussions?
Very random idea. I mean, I guess it came about through prolonged engagement with zine over the past few years, and then realizing how interesting they were, and mainly also because zines are pretty much non-existent in Sri Lanka. There is really no zine culture as such in the mainstream. So that's just how it started, and then engaging more with art books. And then, I don't know, just one day sitting around and talking about how cool it might be to have a whole bunch of zines together in this idea of how does a zine merge with an art book. So an art book is something fixed, something has a sense of permanence, there's a sense of weight and gravitas to it. And a zine is something very casual, something that can evolve, something that is irreverent. Is there some sort of middle ground? Is there some way to deconstruct the art book?
Yeah, I think it was very much sort of zine culture and sort of thinking about democratic ways of producing art. But I think also what we don't talk about enough is like the naivete behind it. Yeah, this is totally like a great idea. Let's publish, let's create this massive thing that's going to cost a ton to produce, right? And that was like something we're reckoning with now, right? So that informed that process. There are these other stories that also emerged out of a pedagogy of being together. There's one time when Halik and I was like spitballing about doing a broadside that was run by artists. And largely because we had been driving somewhere and we'd seen a sign board for a salon that had said, call itself Cali Art. We thought it was both cringy but also incredible. And then that would be the column for the, all art that speaks about the body. These are like the small conversations. Yeah, let's actually seriously think about making and publishing.
We were all interacting at that point of time, I feel, because Colombo Scope had just happened. Cassie, you were in Sri Lanka. There was a sense of these little things popping up constantly with all these little snippets of like ideas and like visuals and sights, not necessarily connected and not necessarily forming some sort of like holistic, profound whole, but still somehow relevant. It's like little collections.
I mean, zine culture also kind of comes from this place of challenging publishing as a monolithic structure. And so were you thinking about, earlier you were talking about, producing work for showing somewhere or for a certain already set in place structure. Were you trying to look at publishing your own work or look at this idea of what does it mean and how can we publish?
Yeah, slightly. I was definitely thinking about kind of working towards publishing some sort of publication of my work. So I was kind of just like playing with this idea of the book, playing with paper and my work and putting it together and thinking about what I wanted the outcome of that to be. And Halik, you were working on a zine that you were thinking of publishing independently as well. Quite a few of us had been on that workshop, right, down in the South, which was also on publication. Those were definitely conversations and things we were thinking about at the time.
Since we're getting into questions of media, I think it's very, very important. It's a freewheeling question about the form, how that might have a bearing in the present. And what is, for you, the sort of place of the collective? We often think of alternative narratives as counter-structure, counter-narratives, and how we are interested in developing counter-publics. How does one create a sort of divergence and a counter to the present norm, or to create some kind of alternative means of perception? Because we're getting to the tenuous place of media.
To think of the present moment, how COVID has shifted the way the art world has thought about programming, we feel is this sort of unnecessary and perhaps not entirely effective shift towards, taking everything online as this way of approaching the challenge at hand. That's something that we're wary of. It feels so strange that like people are now discovering that, oh, we can do this online, we can do that online, this can be a Zoom call. Whereas no, sometimes it can be a text or it can be a printout, or it can be PDF that you download off a website. It can be physical. Not everything needs to be streaming in that sense. And I feel like zines are still a viable form, even in this present context, as something that should survive. It's also been interesting to think of how we use our Instagram as a sort of way of engaging a certain public. It's been interesting to sort of see the following that has slowly trickled in. A few months ago, we did a takeover for this Instagram account called South Asia Art. And that was actually a really interesting exercise for us, because if you look at our own Instagram, a lot of the posts that we put up are like what some might call shit posting. Whereas when we got onto South Asia Art, we sort of came together thinking of like how we can draw from our own practices and content that people can engage with for that particular audience, for that particular public. And that was an interesting exercise in itself, in that after seeing how well received a lot of those posts were, we didn't decide to, okay, now we're going to do this on our Instagram and like start posting the same kind of things on ours, because I feel like that's not necessarily what we want sort of Instagram thing to be. Instagram is kind of where most you see the playful aspect and the sort of irreverent aspect of our approach.
I'm just wondering if shitposting is art, or if shitposting is art because people know where art is. I get a sense that sometimes people are like, oh, that's a really interesting Instagram. It's run by a bunch of artists, but it's really a bunch of artists shitposting on Instagram. So
my phone broke and I was supposed to do a Instagram live poetry reading for that South Asia account. And so I racked my brain, figured out a way to stream off of my laptop. And then once I realized how I could stream off the laptop, I realized, wait, I could be streaming anything. Suddenly there was this potential to play with text, with audio, with video. And really in the course of like a few hours, I familiarized myself with this streaming software, gave everyone a heads up that we were going to go live. And there was no real preconception of what the aim was, what I was trying to accomplish or anything like that, but I just gathered video content. So I particularly used old black and white documentaries of Ceylon, what was Ceylon at the time, a compilation of old Sinhalese and Tamil folk and pop music from like the 60s and 70s and just started like mashing them together. And I had no idea that like these connections were going to happen. But like, while I was doing it and while I was watching it, I was like, oh shit, there's a moment where the singer in Sinhalese is singing about a mother and a child. And in that moment in the documentary, like this little native child like goes onto this woman, all these like absurd coincidences happening. And I started adding text onto the video, and that's where that "don't theorize, just realize" line came in as well. And it was really interesting exercise we decided to call Packet Radio at the time. And like the format in itself came to define itself out of like how we sort of experienced it, not so much from any way it was preconceived. And yeah, so right now we're working on like building an archive of video materials and like music that we might use for a future session. But that was really interesting in the sense of a sort of like format that kind of just came about